I get it. You want to take an old motocross bike and convert it over for off-road and trail riding and enduro riding. I know why you want to do that. It's because there's so many of these bikes out there and you think you're going to save some money. And you might. But let's talk about what happens when you take an old motocrosser and you switch it over for enduro riding. I'm Kyle with Dirt Bike Channel. Stick around. So for a long time, people asked me to take an old motocross bike and convert it over for enduro style riding, off-road riding, trail riding, the type of stuff that I do out in the woods and out in the desert and those types of things. And the reason why people wanted me to do it is because there's so many more of these old motocross bikes out there on the market, because motocross bikes sell like hotcakes and they have forever. And there's not as many of the used KTMs or betas or gasses or Shurkos out there on the market. So you can pick up one of these older bikes for a relatively cheap price, anywhere from $1,500 to $2,500, depending on where you're at and what condition it's in. And you can start upgrading it to make it more trail worthy. So what are some of the things that you're going to need to do this? Because this is kind of the rub that not a lot of people tell you. And I had to do it in order to figure this out. It's not as cheap as you think. Yes, the initial purchase price of the bike is cheap, but then you're gonna put a lot of upgrades and a lot of time into this bike. And you're not gonna do it all at once. It took us 2 years to get to this point with this bike. So we bought it for $1,800, and then we put this entire page and then part of it on the back. All of these different parts into the bike. Some of the parts were mandatory things we had to do, and some of the parts were just parts for fun, like the plastic kit and new wheels and new hubs. An electron carburetor, because you can get by without doing some of these things. But what are some of the main things that you're definitely going to want to do if you take an old motocross bike and want to convert it over for off-road trail riding? The very best money that we spent on this bike was a suspension overhaul. Essentially, we took this to a suspension tuner, Moto Experts, and we had him revalve the thing, respring the thing, and get it more suitable for off-road riding so that it could absorb some of the bumps and some of the chop. And it wasn't so harsh for just like picking up big jumps. That was the best thing that we did to this bike as far as money goes. I'm not a huge suspension overhaul kind of guy, but if you're taking an old motocross bike and you're going to convert it over for off-road riding, absolutely take the time, spend the money to go get the suspension redone for off-road riding. Another thing that you probably want to do is put an 18-inch rear wheel on this. 18-inch rear wheel gives you more rubber on that tire, makes it more forgiving, gives you more traction, makes you less susceptible to pinch flats and things of that nature. So that's something that you definitely will want to do. Other things you're going to need to do probably are gearing changes. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little later, because you're not going to split the case apart and actually change the gear. So you're going to do some sprocket changes to maybe gear the bike down so it's not quite so high in that first gear to do some of the more technical riding, because it's going to be really high in first gear if it's got the motocross gearing. You also might want to do a fuel tank. You might want to do a bigger fuel tank. We didn't do that on this bike because we wanted to do the Polysport replica kit to make it look like a new Honda. But if you're going to take this bike very far, that little motocross tank isn't going to take you very far, so you might want to change that out. You're also going to want to install a skid plate on the bike so that you can get over logs and rocks and roots without damaging your frame. You'll probably want to put handguards. We didn't put handguards yet on this bike because we broke the bank and we spent so much money, but you might need handguards. You might even need a little bit different bend on the bars for what you want to do. It's probably a really good idea to put on a spark arrestor, like a Forest Service spark arrestor, Forest Service approved spark arrestor, so that you're not against the laws and regulations out there on the trails and you're not starting any fires, although I don't think these bikes would start any fires. You might also need to upgrade the clutch. Now, I'm not just talking about like a hydraulic clutch lever up there. I'm talking about the actual clutch the actual clutch on your bike, you might need to put like a really high dollar, say like a Recluse auto clutch in there or something like that, because maybe you did a 4-stroke, maybe a 450, and you just can't keep the bike from stalling, so you put like $1,000 clutch in it. We didn't have to do it on this one because it's a 2-stroke, but it's just another thing that a ton of people end up doing when they get a 450 motocrosser bike. You might also need to do wheel bearings and things like that because it might be kind of old and they might not be rolling too well. And it's amazing how some of these things just start to add up. You might also need to do a headlight because you want to do a bunch of riding at night. So you may need a headlight on the bike. Long story short, this can get very expensive very fast. This is my parts list for this bike here. And if you want, I can email you a copy of this because some people don't believe me how much we spent on the bike. We spent like $1,800, it was $1,800 on the bike. And then here's the number of upgrades we put into the bike. And this doesn't count labor. We put $6,714 worth of upgrades into this bike. Now, not all of those were mandatory. Of the mandatory list, because I've split it out, I've got mandatory cost and then optional cost. The mandatory cost was still $3,500 worth of parts and, well, not labor, I'll get into that, parts into this bike. We had to have a new cylinder. We had to have a bunch of different things that we ended up needing to do. And so the total money that I have into this bike right now is $8,514. It's right here. That doesn't include labor. If you paid a shop even $50 an hour to do this bike, which $50 an hour is low because most shops are $80, that's $4,000 worth of labor. That means this bike is now a $12,500 project. Now, I know you guys are gonna say, Kyle, you're crazy because no one's spending that much money on the bike. And you might be right, but I did spend $8,500 on this bike. And guess what? Now I have an $8,500 dirt bike that doesn't have electric start, that doesn't have the proper gearing, because this still has a 5-speed gearbox that is close ratio transmission. So the gears are spaced really close together for that motocross stuff. It doesn't have a 6-speed gearbox like a lot of the other off-road bikes have, where those gears are spread out a little bit more. They're all, bam, right close together. So it doesn't, so I can gear this up by putting different sprockets on it, or I can gear it down by putting different sprockets on it, but I can't change the ratio between those gears. And so the bike is either super fast and hard to go in the technical stuff, or it's geared down and it's super slow, so it can't get up and move through the transition places. So it's just one of those things where you can end up spending a lot of money, and then still you've got a bike that doesn't have the right transmission, it doesn't have the right spread between the gears, it doesn't have electric start, and maybe, you know, the clutch might be harder to pull. It doesn't have quite as good of brakes as like a lot of the modern bikes. The Nissan brakes that are on this bike are okay, but they're not great. And so we've got a lot of money in this bike, and it's just, it doesn't matter how much money I throw at this and what parts we do, it just never really kind of adds up to like the Shercos that I've been riding and the Betas that I've been riding and the gas, well, actually I haven't ridden a gas enduro bike, but the KTMs and the Huskies. I have a gas trials bike, so that's why it popped into my head. But so this bike is much better than nothing, way, way better than nothing. And if this is the only way you can do it, I say go for it, because the nice thing about it is you can get the bike and then you can start doing some things slowly here and there, and you don't have to spend the money all at once. So that's the good news. The bad news is by the time you've had it for a few years, you've spent just as much as if you would have gone out there and bought like a $5,000 dirt bike that was just a couple of years old, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years old. And I think that might be a little bit better option for a lot of people who aren't going to spend so much time building this thing up, because you're going to end up with $5,000 dumped into this thing over the next 2 to 3 years, depending on how fast you do some of this stuff. And in the end, you're left with a project bike that costs you quite a bit of money. And it's good and it's cool, but it does have some deficiencies that you would not have if you would have just gone out there and bought like an enduro specific bike, like a KTM or a Beta or a Gas or a Husqvarna or a Sherco or a TM Designs. There's a bunch of those guys out that are making them. Honda is making a 4-stroke version of they've got their Honda 250 CRF 250 RX. Yamaha has the YZ 250 FX and the YZ 450 FX. So a lot of these more off-road specific bikes have been coming out and are coming out, and now they're going to be more plentiful in the used market. And it might be a better idea for you to go and get one of those. I'm not telling anyone what to do. I'm just saying with this bike, it was pretty eye-opening, the amount of money that we had to put into this, not including labor, and the amount of time it took, And then in the end, we're kind of left with a bike that's a little bit subpar with these other bikes, even though we have $8,500 in this thing. And it looks great, it looks fantastic. And I don't want to discourage people from doing it. Just know what you're getting into. It's going to be a little bit more expensive than you might think. And in the end, might fall a little bit short of the mark of where some of these other bikes are if you'd have just gone out there and gotten a 3 or 4 year old off-road specific enduro bike. So if you like these videos, please remember to subscribe. Use the links down in the description. Support me on Patreon. I'm only telling you this stuff if you guys like me. If I'm adding value to your life, support me on Patreon. If I'm adding value to your life, use the links down in the description. If I don't add value to your life, don't do any of those things, and don't subscribe and don't watch any of the videos because I don't want you to waste your precious time. Anyway, that's all I've got on this video today, and I hope to see you in the next one.